Hello everyone, this unit is, this is going to serve as your go-to video for Unit 5 material. And so Unit 5 is all about input markets, the factors of production, markets, what goes into determining prices for factors of production, and so on and so forth. And it really, so far, I think we've developed quite a bit of models and tools by which we can tackle the material in this unit. And you'll see that the tools and models are very similar to tools and models that we've developed before. It's just going to require us to, there's just going to be a bit of a twist attached to some of the models, and we'll see that in a bit. So let's go ahead and start off with a example. And so we're going to derive the short-run factor demand curve of a single firm. So I'm going to pick a coffee shop because I obviously love coffee. And I just want to make sure that we have our assumptions laid out pretty explicitly, and I'll articulate throughout this video why these assumptions need to be spelled out, number one, and why they allow us to develop the model that we're about to develop, and therefore develop the intuition and ideas that we're about to develop. But we're going to assume both a perfectly competitive input market and a perfectly competitive output market. So we're assuming that the firm, right, the coffee shop, is a price taker that doesn't have any influence over their price of a cup of coffee. But we're also assuming that the firm, which is a consumer in input markets, because remember, firms are going to be the demanders in input markets. I should actually probably spell that out pretty specifically, right? So firms are going to be the demanders in input markets. They're going to be the ones demanding, laborers or capital equipment, and the suppliers are obviously going to be either capital equipment or workers. They are going to be the suppliers of whatever the factor is. That's besides the point, but we're also going to assume for this model that the coffee shop doesn't get to is a price taker in the input market. This is a short run. We're deriving the short run factor demand curve, and we said in the short run we can't, our capital is fixed, and so we're assuming that the only thing that the coffee shop can decide or alter is the amount of laborers that they actually hire, and they can't influence the wage. They are wage takers, so to speak, the demanders of labor. And so this is going to matter in a bit, and we'll talk about it right now. But let's look at this. As sort of the various production functions associated with a coffee shop. And so here we have the number of laborers, the number of baristas, and we have the total product associated with adding an additional barista, or associated as we add additional baristas. And as always, we're going to care about that term marginal, right? We'll see. Or we're going to introduce that term marginal a lot in this video. And so here reflects the marginal product of labor associated with each barista. And we can see other ideas that we've developed in this class before, diminishing marginal product, both in the total product curve and the marginal product of, when we actually do the calculation, in the marginal product of labor curve. And so this is just a kind of technical point, but the distance between 15 and 0, right? Marginal product reflects the additional product from an additional unit of labor. But, to get a bit more technical, right? Maybe if we decide to take more advanced economics classes in college, this 15 actually reflects the average marginal product between these numbers, because marginal product is a rate of change. The marginal product of labor curve is the slope of the total product of labor curve, or it's the derivative of the total product of labor curve. I know for some of you that haven't taken calculus yet, that sounds like a foreign language, it's just sort of a technical thing that I wanted to add to this. So this distance actually reflects the average marginal product of labor between that point. But that's neither here nor there in terms of the analysis that we're going to be making. All right, so we calculate the distance between these points, and then we end up with 15, 12, 9, 6, and 3. Right, and so we can see diminishing marginal product of labor setting in, which we said since it's a short-run phenomenon, diminishing marginal returns is a short-run phenomenon, and that's why we expect increasing marginal costs in the short run. Then I'm going to argue that what is going to be most, or I'm not going to argue, I mean, what is going to be needed to derive the short-run factor demand curve of a single firm is the marginal product of revenue, right? You don't care about how much a worker produces, you care about how much money you get from that production, right? And so that's going to be important for coming up with the short-run factor demand curve of a single firm. So the marginal product of revenue, luckily, since we're assuming a perfectly competitive output market, we're assuming that this coffee shop is a price taker. We just multiply the marginal product of labor by the price of coffee, which is a constant. And so we get 15 times 2, right? The price of coffee, I'm assuming, is $2. 30, 24, 18, 12, and 6. Okay. All right. And then we can see, I went ahead and graphed the total product of labor curve, as we can see here. The slope varies with output, or I'm sorry, with additional laborers. The marginal product of labor curve, I've deliberately made it a straight line, so it helps our analysis. It's going to be right here. And then the marginal product of revenue curve is going to be represented right here. Okay. So just simple graphs of the data that I showed you. And then the marginal product of labor curve, the marginal revenue product of labor curve really is this, right? It's the marginal product of labor times the marginal revenue, right? Because this is a perfectly competitive output market. The marginal revenue is the price, right? The change in revenue is the price. So that's how we were able to come up with the marginal revenue product of labor curve. And what this really shows is the marginal benefit, right? It's the marginal benefit, the short run marginal benefit a firm gets from units of labor, right? It's the additional benefit that a firm gets from an additional unit of labor. And so it's essentially the firm's short run demand curve, right? So we have a downward sloping demand curve. And the reason why we have a downward sloping demand curve, we said this goes all the way back to the beginning of Unit 2, is because of diminishing marginal utility. And we can see there is diminishing marginal benefit associated in the short run with adding additional units of labor, right? Because of, and then we can connect it back to diminishing marginal product, etc. But this still doesn't tell us where or what would be the optimal amount of labor that we need to determine or what would be the optimal amount of labor for this firm to hire. And because we're assuming a perfectly competitive input market as well, because we're assuming a perfectly competitive input market, we're assuming that this firm has no effects or has no ability to affect the wage, then we can actually use that to our advantage to actually determine the optimal amount of laborers to hire. And we can draw the wage on this graph right here, and it's going to be constant. Let's say a $10 wage, right? That's the market equilibrium. And we can draw the wage on this graph, and that actually becomes the marginal factor cost, the additional cost from an additional unit of labor. And we conduct marginal analysis, and the point at which these curves or these lines intersect, that's going to be the rational number of laborers to hire. Right? We can see it's somewhere in between 3 and 4. The reason why, I mean, it's probably, I mean, we can think about hiring 3.5 units of labor as, you know, having a third or another person after the third person come in for half a day. And so that's kind of why we don't, or that's why we draw lines and curves, right? And we can also imagine that this is in terms of hours of labor instead of units of labor as I had it set. And so we can probably more easily wrap our heads around 3.5 hours of labor. Yeah. And so I just want to say, like, yeah. So it's rational for this firm to, at the very least, have a third laborer, but past a fourth laborer not rational, and maybe, if possible, bring in someone part-time. Okay. And so all of that was really meant to show you that the the demand curve for labor is going to be the marginal revenue product of labor times the marginal product of labor times the marginal revenue. That's how we came up with the demand curve. And because, right, I put this P in pink, because we're assuming a perfectly competitive output market, we're assuming the firm is a price taker, this marginal revenue is just the price. But nonetheless, even though there's a lot of assumptions in this model, we can develop sort of important ideas behind this formula being the marginal benefit of labor and the firm's demand curve for labor. And so specifically, we can develop this idea that it's not just the marginal product of labor that matters, it's also the price, right? The price of the good or the product itself that matters, right? Because we can think of two industries, right? This is kind of like a one-liner that I thought was really cool. I forgot where I heard it, but this idea that maybe the marginal product of labor curves are the same, for whatever reason, of computer chips and Lay's potato chips. But your demand curves are going to be different because of the pricing differences between those two, right? And so we would expect, since we're multiplying the marginal product of labor curve times the price, that the demand curve for Lay's potato chips is going to be further along this axis, or shifted further along this y-axis compared to the demand curve for, I'm sorry, the demand curve for potato chips is going to be shifted further along this y-axis than the demand curve for potato chips, right? And then the optimizing condition is marginal revenue product of labor equals the marginal factor cost of labor. But since the marginal factor cost of labor is just the wage, because we're assuming a perfectly competitive input market, and I should actually draw a little pink dot, right? Because we're making an assumption about, right here, we're assuming a perfectly competitive input market. This is going to be the optimizing condition, right? The intersection of the marginal revenue product of labor and the marginal factor cost, which is just the wage, in a perfectly competitive input market, assuming a perfectly competitive input market, where a firm has no control over the wage that they can give to potential workers. So let's develop out this idea of the short run factor market. So the labor market, the supply curve is going to be upward sloping for the labor market. That's a reasonable assumption. The supply curve will be upward sloping for the labor market, and we're going to complicate this a bit in a while. But it's reasonable to think that as the wage goes up, more and more people will want to work more and more. And then a downward sloping market labor demand curve. But this idea that we have a perfectly competitive input market means that the firm itself has to take the wage, right? And this becomes the marginal factor cost or the wage, and also becomes the marginal factor cost, the wage, and that's it. Oh, yeah, sorry, the firm supply curve. So the firm supply curve is perfectly elastic. If they tried to charge less, everybody would know to move to another firm. And so this perfectly competitive assumption is really, it's a powerful assumption because it assumes that there are, knowledge about what other firms are offering their employees, that they're relatively costless transaction costs to go from one firm to another. When in reality, I think we can kind of see where this is going, that this is not a very realistic market assumption in the works, but we assume a perfectly elastic supply curve. Likewise, we would also assume that if we hired a wage above the marginal factor cost, we would be able to lure all the employees in the market, but we wouldn't necessarily want to do that because we're already at our optimizing condition. Okay, now this is just a little brief aside. We're going to complicate this. We're going to think about where the market labor supply curve comes from, or think about sort of the shape and a bit about the elasticity of the market labor supply curve. And I think it's a reasonable assumption, and we're going to assume after I talk about this that the market labor supply curve will be upward sloping. Sorry, I'm checking the time because I had to be out of here at 12 o'clock. It's a reasonable assumption that as the wage goes up, that the supply for labor will increase. However, or the way that we can think about that is that the opportunity cost of leisure, right? The opportunity cost of not working, that's what we mean by leisure in economics. So the opportunity cost of not working becomes too great, right? Becomes increasingly great as the wage comes up. So there's a substitution effect. I should have drawn this in brown because there's a reason I drew these curves in brown. But the opportunity cost of leisure becomes too great. Trade-off between labor and leisure, and so more people will enter the market, right? Another way to think of it is leisure becomes too expensive, and so people will substitute for labor, right? Leisure in economics, we think of it just as not labor, like sleeping, sitting on the couch, doing stuff other than labor, going to the movies, stuff like that. But labor markets are interesting, and this is kind of a labor market with a bit of a twist, is because it's reasonable to think for most people, leisure is a normal good, right? And we said that as people's incomes go up, people want to purchase more and more normal goods. And right, so as the market wage gets higher and higher, maybe more people will reach their optimal income level and want to purchase more and more leisure. And so we can have an income effect suggesting that perhaps at some point our supply curve is actually backward bending, right? Which is an interesting kind of twist to the conventional economic models that we've been developing in this class so far. And so that's interesting. That's just an interesting note, and it's interesting to know this for the exam itself. We'll talk about applications of this when we get into international trade. But for right now, just keep that in mind. But we're going to assume, which is reasonable, that the supply curve is going to be upward sloping for our models, right? But we just need to know that it's an assumption. Okay, so now let's think about labor factor markets, our long-run labor factor markets, right? So in the long run, the firm can choose the optimal level of capital and labor, right? So capital is no longer fixed in the long run. And so the sort of models that you would develop, right? This is going to be an assumption about perfectly competitive input markets because the market factor cost of labor is going to be perfectly elastic, and so is the market factor cost of capital, or the supply curves for both are going to be perfectly elastic, and the marginal factor cost curve and the marginal factor cost curve of labor and the marginal factor cost curve of capital is going to be a horizontal line. So we're assuming perfectly competitive input markets, and that's an important assumption. But in the long run, of course, we can optimize and we can we can substitute either labor or capital, right? And so how would we go about doing this? Well, lucky for you, we don't need to have this complicated model that we need to develop. First, I should just say that the long-run labor demand curve is necessarily more elastic than the short-run demand curve because you can optimize or you can choose the optimal amount of capital or you can change capital as well. But we don't have to develop any fancy models for thinking about firms' decision making. Right, that would probably be something you would encounter in higher economics classes or more advanced economics classes. But we do have this least cost rule, right, where we're going to say that the optimal amount of capital or labor that a firm is going to conduct marginal analysis, a rational firm is going to conduct marginal analysis to determine whether they should hire an additional labor or additional unit of capital, right? And so the way that they would go about doing this is they would set equal to the marginal product of labor over the product or price of labor equal to the marginal product of capital over the price of capital itself, right? Everyone can see that. That's going to be the optima. Once those numbers are equal, then you're indifferent to adding either a unit of labor or a unit of capital. Right, so we can work through an example where we have output of 20,000 units per day. And since we know that the marginal product of labor and marginal product of capital varies, right, let's just think of this as sort of, we're trying to determine the what the marginal input will be, what the additional input will be in this scenario when this firm is doing, marginal analysis. And so we have a marginal product of labor currently of 100 and a wage of 10, and we have a marginal product of capital of 80 and a rental rate of 5. That's how we think of the price of capital. And so we would, come up with these ratios, marginal product of labor over the price of labor, to find the kind of best bang for your buck, and we would find that workers have an output or are able to produce 10 units of whatever this is per dollar, right? That's their bang for their buck. And capital is able to produce 16 units per dollar. And so this firm would continue to produce or continue to choose capital, right? To substitute capital for labor until these ratios equaled, right? And so this is important too, right? Because it's also, as we're going to switch to the back of the room and talk about the minimum wage, and important to think about this in terms of the substitution effect. Hey, Sondra, what's up? Well, I'm going to record for the...
I'm sorry. They said 9th are coming in here?
Yes, at 12.
Okay.
Do I have like 5 more minutes? I just need 5 minutes to do that, and I'm going to...
It's 11:40, I'm supposed to start covering, but I have class, so I don't know. Okay, I'll be okay.
Okay,
sorry.
No worries. And so we would find or we would need we would be indifferent about adding a unit of capital or labor once these numbers are equal. But right now we're going to, if we wanted to add more of either labor or capital, we would add more units of capital. Okay, so now let's talk about monopsony and minimum wages. And so the monopsony markets. So before, when we developed this minimum wage example, right, in Unit 2, and we talked about government interventions in Unit 2, we were assuming a perfectly competitive input market. We didn't talk about it because we hadn't talked about input markets until now, but we're assuming a situation in which the firm was just a wage taker, right? They had to take whatever the market wage was for what it is, where the firm essentially earned no surplus on the marginal revenue product of workers, right? And so we conducted this kind of rudimentary analysis where we said that if the government set a minimum wage, that was binding, right? If it was above the equilibrium wage, it would create all these distortions in social surplus. We would end up with deadweight loss, right? Market transactions that didn't happen, producer surplus and consumer surplus would change. And depending upon this area of deadweight loss, we might end up with more consumer surplus than before. or less consumer surplus. It really just depends upon this variability rate loss. And then we thought about it, there would be a gap between the quantity supplied of labor, the quantity demanded of labor, and that this gap would reflect increased unemployment from the minimum wage. Now, what's interesting is that this theoretical example is actually at odds with empirical studies of the minimum wage. I wish I had my book, my Alan Kruger book on the minimum wage with me, but I think it's at my home. But empirical studies of minimum wage effects, there have been several studies that have studied minimum wage effects, and they've actually seen that increasing the minimum wage actually doesn't lead necessarily to a drop in employment. Now there's a range, I should say, in which increasing the minimum wage would not decrease employment, right? And so there are several potential reasons for this. Maybe the minimum wage isn't a binding minimum wage, but that's not realistic. Of course, it's probably easy to create a binding minimum wage, or to think you're creating a binding minimum wage, and so forth. But the explanation for this is because our input markets are not perfectly competitive. They're actually, well, I wouldn't want to say monopsonistic, because a monopsony reflects an extreme input market model where one employer is the sole person hiring in whatever that market is. And unfortunately, we're not going to think about the range of possibility that exists between the different types of input markets, either the perfectly competitive input market or this monopsonistic, I guess, input market. There's oligopsony and so forth. But this is going to allow us to develop the intuition and idea behind imperfectly competitive input markets, right? And so here we can see we'll have two assumptions. We'll have an assumption about that there will only be one employer and that we're going to be working with one factor, labor. And so the monopsony model is essentially going to be the inverse of the monopoly model. So we can see that right there. The monopsony model is essentially going to be the inverse of the monopoly, and I think they want to kick me out, so I'm going to stop the video. I'll continue this video probably on my little pad thing.